Welcome back. We are Joanne and Larry Mars with more tips on nature photography.
This episode is about exposure, how to control the amount of light coming into your camera to produce certain effects. We're in scenic Arizona taking pictures of the great outdoors. When you're outside, the lighting conditions can vary a lot, and it helps to have a working knowledge of the basics of exposure. There are three main ways to control the light entering your camera: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Let's start with aperture. Inside the lens is an iris that opens and closes to let either more or less light through. We control this aperture with the f-stop numbers. To let less light in, we roll the aperture dial and set the f-stop to a higher number. This closes down the aperture or iris inside the lens. To let more light in, we open up by rolling our f-stop to a smaller number. Anytime we make an adjustment to control the light, there is a corresponding effect that happens to our photograph. Changing the aperture not only lets in more or less light, but it also changes our depth of field. A higher f-stop number gives us greater depth of field and more things will be in focus. Whereas a smaller f-stop number gives us a shallower depth of field and less of our picture will be in focus. Shutter speed is another way to control our exposure. The shutter is like a barn door that opens and closes to let light and an image into the camera so a photograph can be recorded by the sensor. A common everyday shutter speed is around 1/60th of a second. However, if we want to let in less light, we can dial the shutter speed up to a much faster 1,000th of a second, or even faster. To let more light in, we slow down the shutter speed to, say, 1/15th of a second.
Now, just like with aperture, changing your shutter speed has an effect on the outcome of the photo. Where aperture affects the depth of field, shutter speed affects motion. Water is a good example. This first waterfall photo was taken with a fast shutter speed, such as 1,000th of a second. You can see how this fast shutter freezes the motion of the water droplets.
This second photo was taken with a slow shutter speed, such as 1/15th of a second. The slow shutter causes the motion of the water to blur and look kind of milky. Something to keep in mind when using a slow shutter speed is that if you're holding the camera in your hand rather than using a tripod, the movement of your body can cause some unwanted blurring in your picture. Sometimes, though, you can use this to artistic effect. The third way to control exposure is by changing the ISO. ISO is like your film speed, or how sensitive the camera is to light. A lower ISO number such as 100 is good if you're outdoors in bright light. If it is getting darker and you need to let more light into your camera, you might need a higher ISO setting, such as 800 or even 1600.
As you might expect by now, there are consequences to changing your ISO as well. A lower setting of 100 or 160 will give you nice, crisp, and clear photographs.
As you move to ISO settings such as 1600 or higher, your photos will begin to show some noise or graininess. It's a compromise, and in time you will learn how to combine all these elements to get the very best exposure. No matter which of these parameters you're changing, in most cases your tool to that perfect exposure is the light meter inside your viewfinder. When you're setting your exposure manually, you will need to set your aperture, shutter speed, and ISO so that the meter ends up close to the middle, or zero. This will prevent you from overexposing or underexposing your masterpiece. We hope you enjoyed this episode on exposure, how to control the light coming into your camera to produce much better effects and become a better photographer.
Join us again for our next episode on nature photography.